in my recent travels, and I've traveled far and wide, wherever I go and in whatever conversation that I have, Britain and its anti-war, pro-Palestine movement is always cited as being the kind of example that everyone is trying to attain. And, sometimes you could be within a bubble and you don't really know exactly what's happening. You're really focused on the day-to-day and on the really vigorous work of organizing and promoting and bringing people together and facilitating and all of that. But you don't see the bigger picture, which, is seen by people who are either, standing on the periphery or outside the UK and watching from afar. And it does actually give a very impressive reading that for over 15 months of a genocide being committed in Gaza, that virtually every single week there is an event, either a national demonstration which draws hundreds of thousands every single time, or local events up and down the country held by the movement. And it's quite impressive, especially when you take into context the fact that the current movement, which is held up by 6 main organizations here in the UK, but this is born out of the anti-war movement that was established in 2001 after the 9/11 in Houston, in a friend's house in Houston. Mm-hmm. It's difficult to think that was 23 and a half, 24 years ago. So what has, in your minds, and Yasmine, obviously you're too young to remember back then, but myself and Chris, unfortunately, we remember those days quite vividly. What has it been? What are the ingredients that have made the movement what it is?
Well, I think that what you say is true, that there was an extraordinary anti-war movement that developed after 9/11 back in 2001, which managed to bring together a number of different social forces in British society that were very important. The left, the trade unions, crucially the Muslim communities, but also a wider pre-existing anti-war and sort of peace movement into one relatively sort of unitary and cooperative, collaborative group. And that was very important. It led to demonstrations of first hundreds of thousands, and then, of course, on February the 15th, 2003, 2 million people in the streets. No doubt this was partly because Tony Blair was George Bush's main ally on the world stage in that appalling episode, that terrible, catastrophic invasion. But also, I think it was that we had a movement that was politically defiant and principled and combative in a sense, but at the same time always seeking to be as broad as possible. And it was that combination, I think, that was very important. And it's something that isn't often remarked upon, but on the famous demonstration in 2003, the main slogan was "Don't attack Iraq." Yeah. The second slogan was Freedom for Palestine, which was a decision that we all collectively made because the Palestine movement in its own right was developing fast. Right. But I think that stood us in good stead because the movement, okay, we didn't stop the Iraq war. We did hound Tony Blair out of office in the end. But crucially, I think we won the anti-war argument in British society. And that was connected with the process of helping to educate people about Palestine. And so we came out of that movement with a kind of alliance that has expanded but nevertheless sort of sustained itself and is the forerunner of the alliance that we now have over Palestine, a bunch of organisations, all with a mass base that are used to working together. Two, that we actually did create a body of opinion in British society that rejects foreign interventions and understands, crucially, the connection between these foreign wars and Britain and the United States' support for Israel. The two things are very, very tightly, it's not actually mainly the Israel lobby that is that is creating a situation where the British establishment is so keen to back Israel. It's the fact that Israel is part of the West's strategy to maintain its influence in the Middle East. And I think that understanding is very important.
Obviously what you're talking about is the makeup and the drive of the movement. Because the movement could be addressed from various perspectives. It could be about the makeup, the Muslim community being part of that, the trade unions of the left being part of that. At the time, at the beginning, C&D, for instance, were a third very important element thereof. But and you can also talk about the causes and the issues. And I believe that, the issues, be it that very simple, like don't attack Iraq. You can't be simpler than that, or freedom for Palestine, for instance. But they were nuanced in terms of addressing certain issues that were flagged even by the media as internal issues, tying them, for instance, to the issue of migration. And all of a sudden saying, well, hang on, why is it that hundreds of thousands of people around the world are putting themselves and their loved ones' lives at risk in order to get to Britain? Is it not because of the wars that we are fighting in their countries and the like? But one very important element in regards with the makeup of these movements, and I'm talking about all the organizations from the very start until today, is the youth, is the young. And despite the fact that as the going say, the youth of today are occupied with various other things, with TikTok and Instagram. But when the time came, we found that they were at the very heart of the movement. Every single week, every single event. You'd find that particular element was not only there, but actually leading the way. They were screaming out the chants. They were doing all the organization. They were doing the placards. They were the ones who actually gave, that kind of oomph, if you like, to those movements. Do you agree?
I agree. My dad will often tell me about how that famous 2003 protest, we had 52 coaches coming down from Glasgow. Yeah. And the only reason we didn't have more was because the Labour Party conference was in Glasgow. And so we needed to keep some people so that they could protest in Glasgow. But the amount of youth, he was like, more than half the buses were just full of youth. And anyone from Scotland will tell you, coming down to London, our day would start at like 2 or 3 a.m. In order to get there in time. And people, the level of anger, I obviously I can't tell you because I wasn't there, but I can only imagine what it feels like now, and what it felt like then. And again, I the point you mentioned about the simplicity of the issue, when we look at what's happening in Gaza now, you're either against genocide or you're not. It's not conditional. You're not against genocide in some places, but okay with it in others. And that's what's brought so many people to these protests and to this movement. People that, by the way, would actually describe themselves as Zionists before, and would be like, actually, this isn't right. You're either against it or you're not, right? You're either against apartheid or you're for it. It's not, and I think the hypocrisy that we've seen kind of from the political class and politicians of, when they describe some other issues, right? And they're like, oh, but the genocide in this country or that country. And it's like, well, you're clear about kind of what it looks like. So what's so difficult about it in Gaza, right? And even if we look past that, it's such a stark moment of when Keir Starmer had said, I know the definition of genocide and that's exactly why I'm not using that word. So, okay, let's put that to the side for a second. How many Palestinians are enough for you? Okay, let's not call it genocide. How many Palestinians are enough? Because for me, one is one too many, right? And it's that simple. It's not complex. It's not nuanced. It's not. And when you see consistently every single day the live stream videos and images that are coming out, how can you call that situation complicated?
And that's the fascinating thing about Gaza, particularly that. Sometimes you have to work. You have to really work hard in order to formulate a narrative. you know, to put an entire message within a few words that becomes your slogan. But this time round, tragically, it was so simple. It was so easy. I mean, it wasn't difficult at all. And like you said, I mean, and many people, I know many people who come, as you said, from Zionist families, Jews, whose fathers and mothers proudly declare themselves as being Zionists, were there at every single march simply because they found that from those images, without anyone telling them, that it was just beyond the pale. And therefore, I mean, when we come back and talk about the makeup of the pro-Palestine campaign, that kind of element of Jews, that kind of element was instrumental in not only giving an added fervor to the protest, but also in waving off the accusations of anti-Semitism and the like.
No, I think that's right. And I think one of the things about the movement back in those days and now is that we collectively took the gamble that most people would be against this. And I think that's actually, there's a certain sort of pessimism that tends to pervade the left quite often. And I think trying to get beyond that and trying to at least recognise that there will be millions of people who, when they see someone's boot on someone else's neck, tend to side with the person on the ground who's got the boot on the neck. Now, partly the reason why I think people find that difficult is because the media is so bad, and that those relatively small number of people who actually support Israel in what they're doing at the moment tend to be concentrated at the top of society and so have a kind of disproportionate ideological influence. So it's easy to think that you're isolated. But I think part of the trick here is to recognise that, you know, a lot of the time, most people are kind of decent and can be mobilised, but they will only be able to come out if you offer them a movement, a mobilisation that is broad, that is quite simple and crisp. And that's another thing about the slogans. I mean, there was all sorts of discussions back in the day around Iraq where people said, oh, we've got to have this slogan and that slogan, and we've got to talk about this, that, we've got to condemn Saddam and blah, 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 until there would have been like 10 different things people were marching for. Now, I always think that's wrong, because every slogan, in a way, can take people off the demo as well as bring people on. And I think what we do, free Palestine, out of Gaza, ceasefire now, those simple slogans that appeal to the greatest possible number of people who could be won over is very, very important. It's all about trying to mobilise majorities here. And that's, you know, in the end of the day, that's what we're going to have to do. And that's the whole aim. I mean, you know, being radical means creating a force, a social force so big that it actually can break through and it actually can be enough of a roadblock to stop the establishment getting away with what they're doing. And that's quite a big ask. You can't do that if you're not mobilising hundreds of thousands of people at the seat of political power.
And the impressive thing about this movement over Gaza is the longevity. I mean, the fact that you can bring around 100,000, 200,000, 300,000 week in, week out is impressive in its own right. But to have it over the course of 15, 16 months and still going is unprecedented. In my estimation, it's unprecedented. How do you, Yasmine, how do you continue to tell people to come out? What is it that you have to tell them, or do you not even have to tell them? You have to just say, listen, this is where we're going, and people will turn out because of the images.
I think that's a big part of it, actually. The images that are coming out of it. But I think actually as well, you know, the point Chris was making, you know, if you were only to look at the media, you would think that the Palestine movement was a small movement, right? You wouldn't know that the majority of people in this country stand for a ceasefire, right? And stand for the liberation of Palestine, right? Poll after poll after poll has been conducted that shows the majority of people in the UK support a ceasefire. And actually, the opinion of the government that it's and its policies are that of a minority, right? A complete minority. And that's why week in and week out, whether it's the police putting restrictions or the government attacking us or the media attacking us, et cetera, I think that motivates people. And actually, back to your point about young people, and, people have gotten to the stage where they're willing to risk it all, by the way, for this, because it's so outrageous. Never has such a moment been so defined and so stark in our history. And, people are willing. I know so many university students that have been suspended, and they're like, so what? And what? What use is a degree if your university institution is investing in arms trades, for example, right? People are, at the last protest, I met a doctor, a neurologist, and she's been sacked. And one would think that would stop her from her activism. She was front and center at the protest, right? And there's countless and countless of stories, but people are because, and this is the thing, right? The media, and especially kind of the political class, and I think we saw this most in the last general election, right? You're only presented with two options, right? And really the only difference is the color of the rosette that they wear on election day, right? The same policies, same attitudes, same whatever. And they want to think that's your only options, and you can only vote for either evil or lesser evil, right? And actually, as a movement, our role has to be to think outside the box and to present an alternative, right? And they don't get to be the ones that define our movement, right? They don't get to be the ones that define, because they'll have you think, and they've been gambling on the fact that people will tire out, right? And they've been, they almost kind of want to set the ceiling of our movement, right? But there's no limit to our asks, and there's no limit to what, as a movement, we can achieve. And I think that's what keeps people going, right? And like when you see the sacrifices that people from across the world have been making, whether it's their jobs, whether it's their livelihoods, whether it's students, and you see that, and you're like, how could you not be inspired? How could you not be willing to give it all up? Because if you don't give it up in this moment in time, well, when else will you, right? And that's the thing. People are, the media and the government, they're willing to, they want people to just stay in the comfort of their jobs, and which is why they've doubled down so much on their attacks, right? Like I think, if we talk about kind of when Michael Gove stood up and called us extremists, right? Like, again, you would think the reaction would be, okay, we'd calm down a little bit, would be a bit more low key and whatever and stuff. When I speak, I say I'm proud to be from an organisation that the government called an extremist for our activism, right? If what we're doing gets us that label, then sure, wear it with pride, right? And I don't think, to be honest with you, the political class expected that reaction at all.
Yeah.
From all parts of society.
And this, by the way, through the entire, since Gaza, since October 2023 with the first demonstration, and since the then Home Secretary, Suella Braverman, came out with her accusation that these were hate marches, since then, every single time either the government or the police tried to push back, there was a reaction. There was a greater reaction. People weren't to be cowed. And to be honest, that's something a little bit novel. It's not totally new, but it's a little bit novel on that particular scale, that people would be defiant. And the other thing that I noticed in several of those demonstrations was that people recognized that whilst the reason for demonstrating was what's happening in Gaza and trying to force the government to at least call for a ceasefire, nothing else, which the government was so resistant, both governments were so resistant in doing. But people recognized that these were opportunities to cite an array of issues that we're suffering from. Whether it be the NHS, I saw people carrying placards about NHS, about pay for public service workers, about disparity between rich and poor, about the state of the economy, about everything. Everything. People saw what was happening to Gazan women and raised placards about, well, hang on, if we're talking about women's safety and women's rights and the such, then surely these women also deserve some of that. So tying in things together, all of a sudden, I noticed a level of not only defiance, but also intelligence in terms of seeing what's happening over there and saying, okay, fine, we have problems that we also need to solve whilst we're solving all of this. That's something that really impressed me.
Yeah, no, I think that is definitely a characteristic. I mean, it's interesting when you see or hear a speaker from the stage kind of make some of those connections, whether it's with the sort of risk of wider war or whether it's with why are they spending money arming Israel when the hospitals are in a total state, these kind of points, you get absolutely huge applause and cheers. And so that is part of the situation here. That's part of the mix. It's in the background. There's a general sense that the political elites have let us down, that life for working people in Britain is getting worse day by day, week by week, month by month. And I think that is part of the reason why people keep coming back. I also do think that Yasmine's right, just the visceral sense of shock and outrage at witnessing a genocide in real time is something that, surprise, surprise, is motivating people very, very deeply, because people feel, well, if I'm not prepared to stand up now, when am I going to stand up? That's the truth.
What needs to happen?
And that's something the likes of Keir Starmer and the Labour front bench just don't understand. It's not part of their makeup to be principled on any basis, and so they can't get their heads around that. And that, I think, that has been also part of the reason why the demonstrations have kept going. But I would say one other thing, which I think is very important, which is that the coalition has been at pains to constantly point out that although it's traumatic and frustrating and deeply angering that the carnage goes on, that the suffering the Palestinians continues, nevertheless, this movement is having an impact. Even if it's painfully slow, it is still true that we stopped them banning us, we got rid of Suella Braverman, we put the question of Palestine onto the agenda for the last general election, and we've been part of creating a situation where politically, if not militarily, Israel has lost this war.
Correct.
Israel is a pariah state. Right. Israel is isolated on the world stage, and that will at some stage be a decisive matter. And I think, imagine a world in which people hadn't demonstrated, whether in Britain or anywhere else. That really wouldn't be the case. So, I think it's very, very important to keep asserting this fact. I think people know it, but it's been part of the discussion around the demonstrations. Don't be demoralised. Don't think they don't care about this. Don't think we're not causing them a problem, because why is it that I got arrested? Why is it Ben Jamal got charged? Why is it they called in John McDonnell and Jeremy Corbyn after January the 18th? The reason is because they know that we're winning the argument in society. They are frightened of us. They're concerned about this issue, and they're concerned about losing the whole game here. So it's very, very important that people understand that as part of the motivation for carrying on until we win.
And you mentioned the fact that Israel has lost. I mean, one area where it has definitely lost, and I don't think anyone is arguing against it, is the media, funnily enough, which is owned by, the kind of capitalists, the filthy rich, the Rupert Murdochs of this world and the like. But still, on the media stage, Israel suffered an immense loss. And it's also almost ironic that the very tools that were created as part of the if you wish, the capitalist arm into societies, the TikToks and Instagrams and the like, they became tools of resistance. They became the very tools where people were getting their information rather than from the BBC and from Sky and the like. And they became the tools of expression of whether it be art, whether it be song, whether it be comedy, whether it be that took everyone by surprise, because everyone has different palettes. So people will respond to a comedian different than when they respond to someone who's of a political nature and the like. So again, I mean, I personally believe that this will be something that will need to be researched. It'll need to be discussed and examined. But generally speaking, it was as though we lived through a turning point in the history, not only of Palestine and Gaza, but also of here in the UK and probably even wider. You agree? You don't agree? You seem to be sort of in two minds.
No, I agree completely. And I think, it wasn't the goodwill of politicians or the Labour front bench, or particularly David Lammy, special shout out, but it wasn't the goodwill of him that when he banned kind of, what was it, less than 10% of arms of arms licenses to Israel. That was public pressure, and that was when we saw in the general election members of parliament who are typically kind of anti-Palestine, and they would be in the DMs of the Muslim vote being like, please tell your constituents or please tell your people to kind of vote for me. Because people were like, this is the one issue that's going to define us for years and years to come. And this is going to be the issue that we're going to be asked about. And if we, again, like Chris said, if we haven't taken a stance now, when are we? When are we willing to risk it all? And it's funny because, on the issue of media, I remember this, we had a protest, I can't remember the exact date, but it was outside Parliament. And I remember after the protest, someone had streamed, had projected the words "From the river to the sea, Palestine will be free" onto Big Ben.
Yes.
And the outrage that had caused, like, it was on the front pages, it was, and the way the media were talking about it, you would have generally thought that it was the biggest national security threat to this country, right? And I remember I did a Times interview the next day, and it was me and this other guy, and he was saying, this is causing unease, this is causing tension in this country, this is causing unrest, and this was the same point. The Israeli army still hadn't went into Rafah, and at the time, Biden and Starmer were both talking about this supposed red line, right? That Rafah was a red line, right? And apparently, it only existed in their minds. And I just remember being like, "You've spent so much time and resources and political capital against those that are protesting against the genocide, right? Like you have me on this show to explain to you why you should be more outraged about the genocide itself and the fact that our taxes are being used to fund this war, right? To fund this genocide. We have 1.3 million at the time Palestinians in Rafah, right? That are waiting for the supposed red line. And instead you have me here talking about words that were streamed onto Big Ben. And he was like, and I remember at the time the other guest, he was like, was this your organization? And I was like, no, but I wish it was. I wish it was. Because it's like, the pretend outrage. And, a lot of this actually, one pattern you'll find throughout this entire genocide is how much this isn't based on fact. When the police speak about, for example, the supposed threat, or when politicians and the like talk about kind of the supposed threat these protests and this movement is causing to communities across the country, there hasn't been a single incident of an attack on any place of worship, a Jewish place of worship, right? But again, apparently we're the biggest threat to the Jewish community in the United Kingdom, right? We're when they talk about, again, like, words and chants being streamed, and it's like, so they want us to not lobby our MPs. They don't want us to protest. They want to dilute the language that we use in our protests and chants. And it's like, so can you see that maybe we're not the problem, and maybe the other side might be, right? And so it's just, they have failed in every single way. And when you look at kind of how much has been pumped into the public image of Israel, that is nothing compared to kind of these protests that have dominated the world globe, right? And that can continue to flood the streets of London and across major cities in the UK, not just kind of London. That's something that all the money in the world couldn't have bought. All the money in the world couldn't have manufactured, which is why we see them kind of continuing to escalate, continuing to kind of clamp down on our rights. You have people that are going on protests and being arrested. You have students You have students being expelled from their universities. You have people that are standing against the genocide being charged with terrorism charges. It's a complete farce. It's everything that we have known about rules, order base has completely fallen apart, and that's the very. It's their fault. It didn't have to go this way. That's the thing.
And the thing is that this is being replicated almost around the world. I mean, the images that we saw from America, for instance, really, I mean, heartwarming, I have to say. I mean, the fact that thousands upon thousands of young students at the top universities, which must have cost tens of thousands of dollars to even be enrolled there, and people putting their careers and their studies and their livelihoods at risk by standing in front of, the National Guard being called to university campuses, something that hadn't happened in America since Vietnam. I mean, the images that we saw over there, and the images that we saw and we lived over here, surely, I mean, they talk of a sense of renewal of understanding, of perception. Everything that the media has been building up, has been creating, has been trying to produce over the course of previous decades, particularly when it comes to Palestine, all of a sudden was shot down by a few images coming from Gaza. And the fact is, and this once again I go back to the level of intelligence of the protesters everywhere, the fact that, when we had the National Guard go into Columbia University and take a few students by the scruff of the neck, and one of them was a professor, a female professor, and someone commented then, and I thought, how brilliant is this? She said, hang on, so the very same people whom we backed to the hilt because they said that they were going to Afghanistan and to Iraq in order to free Afghani and Iraqi women, they are behaving like this in front of us, in front of thousands and thousands of cameras. How did they behave when there were no cameras back in Kabul or in Baghdad? Again, tying things together as though things are coming full circle. And all of a sudden, Iraq isn't 22, 23 years ago. Iraq is still present, and we're still holding people to account for what they did. Surely that's something that's unprecedented.
Yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right about that. I don't think what's happening now would have been possible if it hadn't have been for the invasion of Afghanistan and Iraq. It kind of enabled Netanyahu. I mean, there's actually some quite close historical evidence for that, really, and I think that's very important. And it's also true that the kind of, their understanding of the situation, their promotion, their arguments just have become detached from reality. I mean, this stuff about us being hate marchers, it's an upside down kind of Alice in Wonderland world where people marching against the flattening of hospitals, the burning of refugee camps, the massacre of children.
They are the hate marchers.
I mean, we're the hate marchers. And the reality is exactly the opposite. Yeah. Those of us who are marching for peace are actually from all communities. This is an identitarian thing. It's about Palestine, but it's not about identity. True. This is about people from all backgrounds who are the ones who are most concerned about the suffering of people thousands of miles away, and therefore represent the very best of humanity. Yeah. That's the truth. But I would say this, I think you're absolutely right to say that this kind of unhinged rhetoric, this kind of brutal use of force, which is more and more transparent now under Trump, it does open people's eyes, but it also intimidates people. And I think, yes, this is a moment of exposure and it's a moment of, education in the most horrible way, but it won't translate into change unless we're absolutely clear that we have to be out in the streets and that we have to broaden and build a movement. Because one thing, look at the difference between at the moment, the US and Germany, both facing the rise of the right. Yeah. In the US, as far as I'm aware, There's been some demonstrations, but since Trump came to power, not many, not much street protest. In Germany, there's been a massive 250,000 demonstration against the AfD. There's now more protests. That difference is critical because it's not enough for these people to be exposed. They have to be campaigned against. There has to be pushback. There has to be material opposition in the streets, in the communities, in the workplaces, and real defiance. Because if there's not, even if people know this is wrong, you know, we won't resist them because this is partly about power.
And again, I mean, what we saw in the UK last summer, following the Southport murders, and the kind of the creation, the concoction of a narrative that spread so widely, so quickly, so rapidly, and created those kinds of tensions and threats of far-right invasions, as they call them. Thankfully, none of them transpired. But what happened in retaliation was also something. I mean, in Harrow, for instance, just around the corner from my house, was supposed to be a place where the far-right was going to gather. I have to say that there was around 12,000 to 15,000 peace marchers who all came to confront those who had threatened to be there. And again, the flag of Palestine was there, the talk of welcoming immigrants and, we're all here as one and all of this. And all of a sudden, people were talking about the NHS, people were talking about public transport, people were talking about all the issues that really matter to British, tying them all together. And once again, the fascinating thing you mentioned, Chris, that the fallacy of this accusing people who are against the flattening of people's homes as being hate marchers. And let's not forget, I mean, these 15 months of constant events almost every single day throughout the country, the call was for a ceasefire. It wasn't for something outrageous. It was just to stop the bombing, stop the killing. And yet, it so happened that these marches were seen to be the problem, were seen to be the issue. And that's where it becomes absurd to the extent that it becomes worrying. That if there is that kind of power peddled by authorities and the media to change the story so much. I mean, we all read Malcolm X's, warning that if you're not careful, you'll believe in that the oppressor is a good guy and the oppressed is the bad guy. And it's becoming that. I mean, there is that overt attempt to make it seem as though the killer is the one with the right and the killed is the one who is so problematic and being so difficult and not really lying down and dying as they should. But I want to point to what happened 2 days before Trump entered the White House, the 18th of January. And this is where I'd like to hear from you both. Because in my estimation, by far and large, not 100%, but by far and large, the police had defied government pressure to arrest protesters, to criminalize those who were raising the Palestinian flag. If you remember, Suella Braverman wanted to push the police to actually criminalize whoever was holding a Palestinian flag. And the London Met said, that's not going to happen. So by far and large, the police had been reasonable. I might be generous here, but that's how I'm going to say it. What happened on the 18th of January that led the police to shift how they were dealing with the protests and protesters?
Oh, it was commercial. It was commercial. It was.
What do you mean? What do you mean?
It was one strange argument after another. By their own accounts, the police will tell you, again, there was no threats to any synagogue. So their initial argument was, so we wanted to march to the BBC, or from the BBC. So
and there's a synagogue nearby.
Not even on the route. It's on a side street. I don't know, 300 meters away or whatever, right? I personally had never heard of the synagogue until the police had told us about it, and I would like.
Am I right in thinking that the congregation or the members of that synagogue actually wrote to the police saying, "We're fine"?
Yeah.
Am I right?
Yeah. We have members of the synagogue that attend the marches.
Right.
And so they had said, that this is that again, these marches are a threat to kind of the Jewish communities and whatever and stuff. So we, being the accommodating people we are, offered to alternate the route. So start at Whitehall and then go to the BBC. By which point the service will have been finished 2 hours ago. There won't be any congregates at the synagogue. And that was unacceptable, apparently. Apparently then their argument was, no, you can't march the entirety of Shabbat. So the entirety of Saturdays, you can't march past the synagogue. Again, recognising that the synagogue isn't even en route. It's not even, it's not on a main street or anything like that. And again, the argument that they were making that we were a threat, they couldn't back it with any evidence. It was based on feelings. And then we then had said, and so then what they did was they put an exclusion zone. And so we had said, okay, we'll march up to the exclusion zone. And they were like, well, no, then you're disrupting people shopping in the area because it was going to be an Oxford Circus. And I think, I don't know if we had to kind of, maybe we should have gotten a dictionary of what a protest is. I don't know. Like, I think he missed the point of protests being disruptive by their nature, and that kind of being the point. But and then all of a sudden it was one argument after, and you can tell 100% it was a political decision. 100% it was a political decision. And then on the day, from the get-go, as soon as you walked into Whitehall, the pressure and the presence of the police was unlike anything we'd ever seen. And I remember I had went to Cafe Nero to just buy a coffee, and I was walking past Westminster Station, and there was officers surrounding 2 girls, and because they were 2 girls standing together wearing their keffiyehs, that was an illegal gathering.
Oh my word.
Yeah. And it wasn't until I had...
That reminds me of Egypt.
Oh, yeah.
Seriously, that is worrying.
It was maddening. And they had empty coaches ready and on standby, anticipating the amount of people that they were going to arrest. And there was vans upon vans upon vans of officers that had been brought in from across the country. And again, you want to talk about kind of cuts to the public safety and police and whatever and stuff, and it's like, well, when you treat these peaceful marches, and again, we have to go out of our way to call these peaceful. We have to go out of our way to explain that, there's never been incidents or violence or whatever. But again, when you paint a picture of these being the biggest national security threat to this country, you can, it's commercial, right? So we did the rally, and by this point, police had already been arresting people. Before anything had even started, they had already arrested people, illegal gatherings, section this, section that, things that people had never heard of. And then we got on stage, and Ben Jamal had announced that a delegation...
Ben Jamal from the Palestine Solidarity
Campaign. A delegation comprising of the coalition and MPs and heads of trade unions and descendants of Holocaust survivors. We had Stephen Kapos with us, who, by the way, if you ask him about what his experience of these so-called hate marches is, it was actually quite funny. The other day he was saying the only thing he's holding out for is a marriage proposal. He's like, I get huggies, I get kisses. He's like, I've not had a marriage proposal yet. He's like, but I'm holding it. I'm waiting. I was like, okay. And journalists with us and healthcare workers, that they would walk to the BBC. And I think, to be honest with you, all of this is about what it represents. right? The idea that we were going to protest the BBC, their coverage, their complicity. The idea after months and months and months that nothing could clamp down on these protests, could reduce these protests, could stop these protests. And this is whilst, I agree that you were being slightly generous when it comes to with your description of the police, but I think we have to recognise as well, again, behind the scenes, the police have been arresting people and charging them with terrorism charges across the country for protesting mainly at weapon arms factories, which have been the only companies out this genocide to profit. Whilst for the working class in this country, living circumstances have been getting harder and harder. Weapon manufacturers have been getting richer and richer. And those that invested them from the political and media class, again, have been getting richer and richer. So that disparity within that stark difference kind of tells you kind of who profits and who gains from wars, right, and from this genocide. And again, what we saw after so we had begun walking and marching, and we walked up to Trafalgar Square, and the police said to us, filter through. They told us, come through, filter through. We walked through, and then the police then, a little bit past Trafalgar Square, had their police vans blocking the road. And so Ben and John MacDonald and Chris had said to them, "We'd like to walk through," and they said no. And so they had said, "Well, we'd like to formally request that a delegation of 25 people are able to register their protest at the BBC." And the officer at the time, he had said, "That's something I have to take up with kind of his line of command." And whilst we were waiting for that response, all of a sudden we found 4 or 5 officers just grabbing Chris, and it was so violent, and dragging him and just completely pouncing on him, and that was and it was maddening to see, to be honest with you. And they just started grabbing people. They just started it turned completely violent from in milliseconds, and it wasn't. And then so we then had told people to kind of disperse because it was just getting way too dangerous for anyone. And then the days that followed after that, we found out, the day after, we found out that Ben Jamal, John MacDonald and Jeremy Corbyn had all gotten letters for interviews.
Yeah.
So they all went and got interviewed, after which they were told that there would be this grand process. They would be told within a week whether or not they would be charged. It only took officers 30 minutes after the interview had finished for them to charge Ben Jamal. So it was a very thorough process. And we're here today.
Chris, you can't talk about the details or the ins and outs, but let me ask you about this. From what you have now experienced, not only seen, but actually experienced, what can you tell me about how you see the immediate future of not only the movement, but generally speaking, this relationship between people who wish to exercise their rights and protest about various issues, including Palestine, and authorities, including the police, government, and the like? How do you see this panning out?
Well, what I will say about the 18th of January, first of all, is that, I mean, we are in a very serious situation now, for the reasons that Yasmine outlined. I mean, we faced a situation where the police were telling us days before the demonstration that there was only one route we were allowed to go on, and that was the route that they had made up. It wasn't a route we requested. It was a route they told us that we had to go on. That was the only place we could protest. That's unprecedented. But secondly, we were told that, or the way it panned out on the day, was that a delegation of individuals, including MPs and the kind of people that Yasmine talked about, were not allowed to go to the BBC, the state broadcaster, to lay down flowers. 25 people were not allowed to go down. And indeed, in order to enforce that, a whole bunch of people were arrested. 77 people in the end. Now, it strikes me that, first of all, there is no way this could have happened, and particularly the fact that Jeremy Corbyn and John McDonnell were called into or invited into the police station the next day. This couldn't have happened without the say-so of the Home Secretary and the Prime Minister. It's inconceivable. So, this is a very serious attack on the right to protest that is being implemented.
But surely the police have always resisted government interfering into their command, their operations and the like. Why have things changed so much?
Well, I think there was more tension between Suella Braverman and the Metropolitan Police than there is between the Labour government and the Metropolitan Police. That's one of the factors here. I suspect they thought a ceasefire may be an opportunity because the numbers they hoped, be dwindling, that this was a chance to finish off this movement that has been causing them so many problems. Now, none of those things have come to pass, actually. It's quite clear that Trump's activities are going to create a situation where the ceasefire is almost certainly going to, uncertainly going to unravel. And secondly, the gamble that the movement was in decline has not turned out to be true. And I think that actually what's happened and what the authorities have done has re-energized people, has made people feel, this is very important. The two things, Trump and the attacks, have actually led to a situation where I believe that this Saturday's demonstration, February the 15th, is probably going to be one of the biggest demonstrations we've had. It's marching from Whitehall, very symbolically, to the US Embassy. I think there's going to be an absolutely enormous turnout on that demonstration. So I think their gamble on that front was wrong. And I think we have to say that when your right to exercise, to protest is being attacked, the most important response is to exercise that right, is to make sure that not only, you come out yourself, but to make sure that you actually put the argument to your workmates, put your argument to your fellow students, put your argument to your community, that actually this isn't just about the Palestine movement. It is about Palestine, but it's about much more than that. It's about a government that feels as if it's losing its credibility, that it's losing support, that there's lots of anger against it, and so it's lashing out. And that's dangerous for trade unionists. It's dangerous for anyone who's against the cuts, who's against austerity, who's against racism, who wants anyone who dissents from the direction this government wants to take society in is under threat at the moment. And that's why there has to be this unity now. There has to be, all decent people have to say, look, come on, this is unacceptable. These are people who are protesting for peace against mass murder, and you are trying to criminalise them. You are trying to say that they are a problem in society. Clearly that's not the case. I think the vast majority of people in their bones know that's true. And so what we have to do is to call to people to say, this is a moment of importance. It's a moment of danger for society, and it's a moment when people must stand up and be counted.
Guys, thank you very, very much. That was excellent.